Okay guys, welcome to my history lessons. So let's go. We are going to look at the Korean War. But before we start, make sure that you have your notes, which means that you have your physical notes with you so that you can take down whatever you need to take down. And to take down things, obviously, you need a pen. Please don't sit there and wait for me to nag you. I'm not going to. Okay, well, I just did. Make sure that you are comfortable, not on your bed, and you've had enough sleep. So if you don't have any of these things, please pause the video now and go and get it. And which means that if it is now 1 a.m., go and sleep and get it done tomorrow morning when you are actually rested. Okay? So let's go. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 for Sec 4 curriculum is Korea. And we are in the middle of talking about how the Korean War was developing. Was it a civil war or was it a proxy war? And you can see from my argument over here, my opinion is that it started as a civil war, then it evolved into a proxy war. Let's have a look at that. Okay, in your notes, guys, you are going to see this column. I have already gone through the events in class, but if you still need help, this is what this table is supposed to do. You are supposed to fill up the nation. So let's say I have the USA. And I know that one of the USA's intentions is to defend South Korea. And what did they do? They pushed back the North Korean attack to the 30th parallel. Okay, but I also know that they had another intention, which is to push back communism, right? And so what I want you to do is to go and find out what are the actions that prove that the USA is trying to push back communism. So I would like you to do this for every single nation involved, North Korea, South Korea, the USA, the USSR, China, okay? And all this will help you to understand really what each side wants. And this is critical for your understanding for source-based questions, okay? The slides are uploaded on the Google Drive, okay? You already have access to them. It is page 55 of the textbook. The textbook does sum it up quite nicely, but you need to plow through it, but that is your job. Go and do it, okay? So if you haven't done that already, I need you to pause the video right now and go and get that done, because without knowing what is going on in the Korean War, the next few minutes will not make any sense to you. So I say again, if you haven't done this, go and do it first. Okay? Okay, now I assume that it is done. So remember, we were talking about when did the war start? 25th June 1950. Okay, must remember this date. After 6 months of fighting, we know that the North Koreans, they attacked first, they were pushed back, and then the Americans decided to go into North Korea, and then the Chinese counterattacked, and then all the troops were stuck in what we call the meat grinder, right? They were stuck at the 30th parallel for 2 years, okay? And we know that after 2 years of fighting in which no ground was gained, okay, if you need some visualization, you can pause the video and go and look at Google Maps, okay? Or Google for maps of the Korean War. That should help. What happens is that everybody is sick of fighting. The North Koreans, not the North Koreans, the Chinese, they are fighting in a country that doesn't belong to them. The American soldiers are like, what are we doing halfway across the world fighting for a war which I might not personally believe in? Stalin just died, in March 1953. Let me write it down. March 1953, Joseph Stalin dies after 28 years of rule. Why is this important now? Because when Stalin dies, right, basically the USSR, they lose their impetus, their momentum to stay involved in this conflict. They want to settle things at home. So what we see is a trend of all the major powers wanting to reduce conflict and end the war. Okay. However, North and South Korea want to keep fighting. Why? Because remember why they started fighting in the first place? It was about the issue of reunification, right? Both Kim and Ri want Korea on their own terms. Remember, Kim is communist, while Ri is, shall we say, authoritarian democratic. Okay. So this is the weird part. after 6 months of fighting or so, they decided, okay, we need to have a negotiation, right? But the negotiation took forever, and they continued fighting while the negotiations were going on. So there was an attempt to negotiate, but it took forever. Okay. Now remember the difference in this point and this point. Okay, because we're gonna use it as evidence for what's coming next. So on July 27th, nearly a little bit more than 3 years later, an armistice is signed. An armistice is an agreement. Okay. Basically, you can think of it as it's not really a ceasefire. It's like hitting the pause button. Okay. And it was intended to be temporary. There is supposed to be some kind of resolution between North and South Korea, which there clearly is not yet. Okay, and what did the armistice say? A suspension of open hostilities. Suspension means to stop, right? To pause. Open hostilities here means outright war. It means I do not commit my military fully to an assault or a defensive action, but instead I return to remember what we were calling border actions, border skirmishes, smaller fights. Okay, the armistice also meant that a fixed demarcation line that's say to mark out, this is it. Okay, don't cross this line, which we have talked about, the DMZ. Remember the one where I was talking to you about the excuse me, the nature reserve. And they agree that they should be able to transfer prisoners of war, like we saw in the video at the start of the chapter. Okay. It is a temporary measure, however, it is still in place. So the war, well, it has, in one sense, the fighting has stopped, but in another sense, the war has not ended yet, right? This is the DMZ, you should be familiar with it. So we know the story. The question is now, what does the story really tell us, right? Remember Jimmy the Camel? Okay, a lousy example. Let's stick to this, okay? And so now we are talking about the Korean War. Is it a civil war or is it a proxy war? Okay, remember civil war means it's a fight within the house, right? Okay, these are the two criteria that I'm giving you. Characterized by domestic issues, that means what are they fighting over? Okay, domestic issues versus international conflict. Okay, international conflict here we are talking about what? Communism versus democracy, right? And what is the domestic issue? It is reunification of Korea. Okay. Other than what is going on, oh shucks, I'm so sorry. Let me change my pen ink color, purple. These 2 points are looking at who is involved. So if it's a civil war, there should only be people within the country, right, concerned with the issue. But a proxy war means that the superpowers are definitely involved and they are using somebody as proxies. Remember, proxy means a substitute. Please remember at this juncture, at this point, if you forgot what a proxy war is, please pause and go and Wikipedia it, go and Google it, go and find out a basic working definition. Okay? So now that we know 3 things: what is a civil war, what is a proxy war, and we know what happened in the Korean War. So what we're going to do now is try to decide whether the Korean War was a civil war or was it a proxy war. I will offer you 2 different arguments. First, let me just point out the events of the Korean War. Now, events in red, let me select my red ink. Red indicate communist bloc actions. And as you can imagine, blue indicates, shall we say, the Western Bloc led by the US, loosely aligned with democracy. Superpowers, actually this should be purple because it's both the USA and the USSR. Whereas everything on the northern side of this line, which, okay fine, looks like the 30th parallel, all these are Korean issues, which is to say, this is domestic involvement. Okay, so straight away from the timeline, we already can tell that different actions indicate different things about the Korean War. So let's talk about why it's a civil war first. Now, remember we were talking about who is involved and what is it over, right? The genesis, which is say the origins of the conflict, domestic. What is it over? It's over the issue of Korea, right? Who rules Korea, and who is in charge? What is the idea in charge? Okay, and I think a stronger argument, rather than just who is involved, who is fighting, is the fact that the domestic conflict is not yet resolved. Remember what I say, that the fighting is over, okay, but the state of war, as I've mentioned in class before, is still ongoing, okay. If you do some research, it will tell you that North Korea and South Korea are technically still at war with each other. Doesn't that mean if you are still in conflict, it means the issue is not resolved, which means it's still a civil war lah. Okay? So far so good. If you don't understand, please pause it, go and look back at your notes again. Now we're going to look at why the Korean War is a proxy war. Okay? So we'll go through the first criteria. Who is involved? Okay, many international bodies, the UN, China, superpowers means both the USA and the USSR, and they were using North Korea and Korea as proxies, right? In the case of the USA and China, they got physically involved, as well as UN troops. How many countries were there? 21 countries, including the USA. Okay, and if we take this point of view, it means that the Korean Peninsula, the entire chunk of Korean land, is an ideological battleground. So was the issue over unification? No, the issue was over communism, right? We know that Russia and China, they saw the Korean Peninsula as a buffer zone, and the Americans were also interested in it. Okay, so Korea, the physical space is Korea, but what is the fight really about? It is about a battle of ideology. And if we look at the ending, didn't the war end? That is what the people who are taking this argument would say. Yeah, Korea started it, but the superpowers ended the war. So the question becomes, if I can end the war, doesn't that mean that I'm in control, that I am the king here? And that is why it is a proxy war. Okay? So we have seen both sides. We have seen why it is both a civil war and proxy war. And this is what I would like to suggest, that it went from civil to proxy. So it started off as a domestic conflict, but it became something which was resolved by the superpowers, right? So it became a full-scale proxy war. Okay? So let's say you were supposed to explain something or to offer a conclusion. There are two ways you could do about it. Okay, you could say that it was a civil war by saying that Korea is still split, or you could say that it's a proxy war. Why? Because the fighting clearly ended. Okay. So that will bring us to the end of the chapter. I will go on to continue the final bit, which is rather short. And before we go, here is your joke of the day. Graph paper. You should never trust graph paper. Why? Because it is always plotting something. Sorry, it is always plotting something. Okay, now you can plot the next essay you're going to write for me. See you.